Deep inside a limestone cave system in South Africa, beyond narrow passages that force researchers to crawl on their stomachs and slide down vertical shafts, a chamber was discovered that should not have existed in the story of human evolution. The space was almost completely sealed from the outside world. There were no signs that large animals had entered it. There was no evidence, yet scattered across the floor lay hundreds of bones belonging to a creature that looked human, but not human enough. The cave was called the Dinaledi Chamber. To reach it, explorers had to descend through a twisting corridor barely wider than a human shoulder. The journey required squeezing through a gap only about 18 centimeters across, then lowering down a sharp drop into total darkness. The difficulty of the path immediately created a problem. If modern researchers struggled to reach the chamber with helmets and lights, how could ancient bodies have ended up there? At first glance, the bones appeared familiar. Hands with opposable thumbs, feet shaped for upright walking, teeth smaller than those of apes. But then the contradictions began to appear. The skull was small, much smaller than a modern human. The brain volume was closer to a chimpanzee than to Homo sapiens. Yet the body proportions were clearly adapted for long-distance walking across open landscapes. This combination had never been seen before. The skeletons were not from a single individual. They represented many individuals of different ages, including children, adults, and elderly members of the same species. The remains were mixed together in the chamber, not arranged by water or predators. There were no bite marks from carnivores. There were no cut marks from tools. The bones were intact and undisturbed. The first interpretation was simple accident. Perhaps a group had fallen into a natural trap and died, but the cave structure did not support that idea. There was no vertical shaft opening directly to the surface above the chamber. There was no slope leading downward from outside. The only access was the same narrow passage modern researchers used. That meant bodies would have had to be carried or intentionally placed inside. This possibility introduced something far more difficult to explain. Intentional body placement suggests behavior beyond instinct. It implies awareness of death. It implies group cooperation. In modern humans, such actions connect to ritual or mourning. Yet the brain size of this species suggested a cognitive ability far more primitive than such behavior would require. Dating the remains became the next challenge. The bones did not lie near volcanic ash layers, which often allow precise radiometric dating. Instead, scientists had to rely on uranium series dating and surrounding mineral deposits. Early estimates varied widely, some suggesting over 1 million years old, others much younger. The anatomical features suggested extreme age, closer to early human ancestors. But later analysis revealed a shocking result. The remains were only around 300,000 years old. That date placed them at the same time as early Homo sapiens. In other words, a creature with a brain far smaller and anatomy more primitive lived alongside humans who already used complex tools and possibly early language. This contradicted the traditional model of a clean evolutionary progression from primitive to advanced. Instead, multiple human-like species appeared to share the planet simultaneously. The species was eventually named Homo naledi. The name referenced the chamber of stars where the bones were found. But naming it did not solve the problem it created. Its anatomy looked ancient, yet its age was relatively recent. Its brain was small, yet its behavior suggested intentional actions. It walked like a human, but climbed like an ape. Each trait pointed in a different evolutionary direction. The hands revealed long, curved fingers suited for grasping branches, yet the wrist structure allowed precision grip needed for tool manipulation. The shoulders were positioned high like those of climbing primates, but the legs were long and efficient for endurance walking. The feet were nearly indistinguishable from modern humans, indicating habitual bipedal locomotion over long distances. Such a combination forced scientists to reconsider how evolution operated. Instead of traits evolving together in a single package, Homo naledi seemed to mix characteristics from different time periods. It looked like a mosaic assembled from distant ancestors and later humans. No single ancestor species could easily explain its structure. Even more puzzling was the number of individuals found. Over 15 separate individuals were identified from the chamber alone. The repeated presence of bodies suggested the location had been used more than once. This was not a single catastrophe. It was a pattern. If these bodies were intentionally placed, the species possessed a form of social structure capable of cooperation and memory of place. They would have needed to return repeatedly to the chamber, navigate darkness, and carry deceased members deep underground. Such actions would require planning and communication, yet the brain volume averaged only about 500 cubic centimeters, less than half of modern human capacity. Traditional anthropology links large brains to complex behavior. Homo naledi appeared to break that rule completely. The discovery triggered intense debate across the scientific community. Some researchers argued that unknown environmental processes carried the bones inside. Others insisted intentional placement was the only viable explanation. But every alternative mechanism required unlikely coincidences that failed to match the physical evidence. The chamber itself preserved the remains in remarkable condition. Temperature and humidity remained stable. There was minimal airflow. Sediment accumulated slowly. Over time, bones rested undisturbed, protected from scavengers and erosion. The cave acted almost like a natural vault, recording an event whose purpose remained unclear. What troubled researchers most was not simply the existence of another human relative. It was the implications for intelligence. If a small-brained species performed deliberate actions traditionally associated with advanced cognition, then brain size alone could not define behavioral complexity. The foundations of how intelligence evolved would need re-evaluation. The discovery also complicated the idea that Homo sapiens uniquely developed symbolic or social awareness. Homo naledi suggested that multiple human species may have experimented with similar behaviors independently. Evolution might not have been a ladder, but a branching network where different lines discovered similar solutions. The deeper scientists examined the fossils, the more contradictions emerged. Teeth showed a diet similar to humans, not specialized plant grinding like apes. Bone density indicated frequent movement across land rather than tree dwelling. Growth patterns suggested long childhood development compared to other primates. Each piece of evidence pushed the species closer to human behavior, while its brain size resisted that conclusion. Inside the darkness of the chamber, a question remained unanswered. Why would a small-brained species repeatedly enter a dangerous cave system carrying their dead? The act carried no immediate survival benefit. It consumed energy and risked lives. Evolution usually eliminates such costly behavior unless it serves a deeper purpose. The Dinnerledy chamber did not simply reveal a new species. It revealed a behavior that did not match the expectations of evolutionary theory. And from the moment the first bones were lifted from the cave floor, the history of humanity became far less certain than it had ever seemed before. The first weeks after the discovery were dominated by careful documentation rather than interpretation. Every bone position was mapped, photographed, and catalogued before removal. The arrangement did not resemble a scattered accident. Instead, the bones lay across the chamber floor in clusters, often near each other, in ways that suggested bodies had decomposed where they were placed rather than being transported by water or dragged by animals. Sediment layers offered a crucial clue. If flowing water had carried the remains inside, it would have sorted them by size and weight. Lighter bones would accumulate in one area while heavier bones settled elsewhere. Instead, the remains showed no such sorting. Small bones lay beside large ones, and fragile structures remained intact. This indicated that the bodies had arrived intact and decomposed in place over time. Another test involved searching for marks on the bones. Predators leave distinctive patterns when feeding, and scavengers leave scratches and fractures while tearing flesh. Under magnification, the fossils showed none of these. The absence of tooth marks suggested the bodies were never exposed to open environments where carnivores could reach them. They had entered the chamber without interference and remained protected from other animals. To confirm the pathway, researchers recreated the cave route using modern volunteers. Even with artificial lighting and climbing gear, the descent required deliberate movement and coordination. One narrow segment forced explorers to rotate their shoulders sideways while exhaling to reduce chest width. Another required a careful slide down a steep chute into the chamber below. These obstacles made accidental entry highly improbable, especially for multiple individuals across different times. If individuals did not fall inside, they must have been placed there by others. But placing a body deep underground required navigation in darkness. The cave lacks natural light beyond its entrance passages. Anyone moving through it would need some form of illumination. Evidence for controlled fire was not directly preserved, yet soot traces in nearby passages hinted that ancient occupants might have used simple flames as light sources. That possibility expanded the behavioral implications dramatically. Fire control is usually associated with advanced human species possessing larger brains. The presence of such activity in connection with Homo naledi suggested either independent discovery or cultural transmission from another species. Both possibilities complicated the established narrative of human development. The bones themselves offered additional evidence about how these individuals lived. Muscle attachment points on the arms were strong and well-defined, indicating frequent climbing. Yet the hip structure aligned with efficient upright walking over distance. Unlike apes, whose pelvis supports tree movement, this species had a lower body built for terrestrial travel. They were neither forest specialists nor purely open land runners, but capable of both. Dental wear patterns revealed a varied diet. Microscopic scratches showed consumption of tough plant material mixed with softer foods, possibly including roots and occasional animal matter. The pattern resembled generalist foraging behavior, the kind that supports adaptability to different environments. Such flexibility might explain how they survived alongside other human species without direct competition eliminating them. The brain, however, remained the central mystery. Endocast studies, where the inner surface of the skull reveals brain shape, showed regions associated with motor control and social awareness proportionally developed beyond what size alone predicted. While the total volume was small, certain areas appeared organized in ways resembling later humans. This hinted that complexity might depend more on neural organization than raw volume. Growth rings in teeth showed childhood lasted longer than in most apes. A prolonged juvenile period suggests learning and social interaction. Species with extended development typically rely on group knowledge transmission. This, again, supported the possibility that behaviors such as body placement were socially learned traditions rather than random acts. Repeated deposition events were confirmed through dating of multiple bones from different individuals. The times between them spanned years or even generations. This chamber had not been used once, but revisited many times. That meant the species remembered the location and deliberately returned to it. Memory across generations implies communication beyond immediate imitation. The discovery also raised ecological questions. Around 300,000 years ago, southern Africa hosted several hominin populations. Early Homo sapiens, other archaic humans, and now Homo naledi occupied overlapping regions. Instead of a single dominant lineage, the landscape contained a mosaic of related species adapting in parallel. They may have encountered each other, exchanged behaviors, or avoided direct interaction. If interaction occurred, it might explain advanced behaviors in a small-brained species. Cultural transmission does not require genetic similarity. Observing another species perform an action can lead to imitation if cognitive capacity allows. Homo naledi may have learned certain practices from neighboring populations, maintaining them even without large brain expansion. But this theory introduced another difficulty. Cultural adoption usually leaves tool evidence. Yet, in the chamber, no stone tools were found directly associated with the remains. Either tools were not used during deposition, or they were removed after placement. The absence maintained the ambiguity between ritual and practical disposal. Researchers also examined bone fractures to determine whether bodies had been processed before placement. Some cultures remove flesh prior to burial. The naledi bones showed natural breakage consistent with decomposition rather than deliberate defleshing. This suggested bodies were placed intact rather than prepared elsewhere. Temperature studies revealed the chamber maintained stable conditions year-round. Such stability slows decay odors reaching the surface, meaning the site may have functioned as a safe place to keep decomposing bodies away from living areas. Even without symbolic meaning, practical avoidance of disease or predators could motivate repeated use of the cave. Yet, practical disposal does not fully explain the effort required. Carrying a body through tight passages consumes time and risk. Simpler locations existed nearby. Choosing this specific chamber repeatedly indicates either tradition or belief connected to place. Even a basic concept of returning the dead to a consistent location suggests cognitive mapping and shared understanding. As evidence accumulated, scientists realized the discovery was less about classification and more about redefining what behaviors early humans were capable of. Homo naledi combined primitive anatomy with actions that implied planning, cooperation, and memory. The assumption that intelligence increased only with brain enlargement became increasingly unstable. By the end of the initial study phase, the chamber no longer appeared to be a random accumulation of fossils. It looked like a record of deliberate behavior repeated across generations by a species whose mental capacity, according to previous models, should not have allowed it. The bones remained silent about their intentions, but their placement spoke clearly about pattern. Something guided these individuals into darkness again and again, leaving behind a mystery not only of what they were, but of how they thought. Once the excitement of the discovery settled, attention shifted toward anatomy. Classification in human evolution depends heavily on physical structure. Every known human ancestor can be placed within a branching tree largely through the shape of its bones. The expectation was simple. Careful measurement would reveal where this species belonged. Instead, the measurements created more confusion. The skull was the first major contradiction. Its volume averaged just over 500 cubic centimeters, similar to early members of the genus Homo that lived nearly 2 million years ago. Yet, the cranial shape was not identical to those early ancestors. The brow ridge existed, but was not as heavy as in Homo erectus. The back of the skull curved in a manner closer to later humans. It looked both ancient and modern at the same time. More surprising was the internal organization. Endocasts suggested frontal regions associated with coordination and decision-making were proportionally developed beyond expectations for such a small brain. The species did not simply possess a scaled-down primitive brain, it possessed a rearranged one. The teeth added another layer of inconsistency. Compared with earlier hominins, the teeth were relatively small and simple. There were no massive grinding molars typical of plant-specialized diets. Instead, they resembled generalized human dentition capable of processing varied foods. Wear patterns indicated repeated chewing of abrasive materials, suggesting exposure to environmental grit rather than specialized feeding. The jaw lacked a true chin, separating it from modern humans, but it was also not as protruding as in more primitive ancestors. This intermediate condition could not easily be placed on a linear evolutionary path. It represented neither an obvious predecessor nor a descendant. Moving to the upper body, the shoulders were positioned high and forward, similar to tree-climbing primates. Such placement increases overhead arm mobility but reduces efficiency in throwing or endurance running. This implied that climbing remained an important behavior, yet the rest of the body contradicted a life spent mainly in trees. The rib cage flared outward at the bottom like that of early hominins, suggesting a larger gut adapted to processing fibrous plant foods. However, The waist narrowed above the hips, allowing rotational stability needed for walking long distances upright. The species appeared engineered for two environments simultaneously. The hands were perhaps the most revealing structures. Fingers were strongly curved, a trait associated with gripping branches. But the thumb was long and robust, with joint surfaces capable of precise operation and tool-capable anatomy. Muscle attachment points around the wrist indicated pelvis was closer to modern human proportions. The legs reinforced that impression. They were long relative to the arms, a ratio typical of species adapted to terrestrial locomotion. Knee joints aligned to support body weight over extended strides. The ankle stabilized forward movement rather than grasping. All signs pointed to habitual bipedalism across open ground. The feet were almost indistinguishable from ours. The arch supported shock absorption during walking and running. The toes aligned forward instead of spreading for branch gripping. Only minor differences separated them from modern human feet. In isolation, the foot could easily be mistaken for that of Homo sapiens. This produced a paradox. The species possessed a body designed for walking long distances, hands capable of manipulation, and a brain smaller than expected for coordinating these abilities. Evolutionary theory often predicts that such integrated features arise gradually alongside brain expansion. Here they existed without it. Scientists compared each bone to known species. The skull resembled early Homo. The shoulders resembled Australopithecines. The legs resembled modern humans. The hands combined traits from multiple eras. Instead of fitting neatly into a branch, the anatomy appeared assembled from separate evolutionary stages. One explanation proposed evolutionary isolation. A population separated from others might retain ancient features while independently developing newer ones suited to its environment. But this required a stable environment lasting hundreds of thousands of years without being replaced by more advanced species. Given overlapping populations in Africa, such long isolation seemed unlikely. Another possibility involved convergent evolution. Traits beneficial for survival may evolve independently in separate lineages. Walking efficiency, for instance, could develop without large brain expansion if environmental pressures favored endurance travel. Precision grip might arise for food processing rather than tool creation. In this view, similar solutions appeared in different species without direct ancestry. Yet the sheer number of mixed traits made coincidence difficult to accept. Each anatomical region pointed to a different evolutionary timeline. Together they formed a mosaic inconsistent with simple branching evolution. Growth patterns in bone suggested a body size smaller than modern humans, but within similar proportions. Individuals stood roughly 1.5 meters tall. Their body mass indicated active movement rather than sedentary habits. Combined with limb structure, they likely traveled regularly across varied terrain. The inner ear canals, responsible for balance, matched upright walkers rather than climbers. This indicated that despite climbing ability, daily movement centered on ground locomotion. Trees may have served as refuge or resource rather than primary habitat. The more precisely scientists measured homonality, the less certain its placement became. It did not represent a transitional form in the traditional sense. Transitional fossils typically display gradual progression from one state to another. This species displayed specialized combinations from multiple directions. The anatomy alone suggested that the human lineage was not a single path, but a web of experiments. Multiple populations may have adapted in parallel, each emphasizing different features. Some increased brain size early, others optimized movement, some combined both. Homo naledi appeared to represent a branch where efficient movement and social behavior developed without corresponding brain enlargement. If correct, this meant intelligence might not originate purely from brain size increase, knowing they might evolve semi-independently. By the end of anatomical analysis, classification remained unresolved. The bones described a creature comfortable on land, capable in trees, potentially skilled with objects, and cognitively unexpected. It was not primitive enough to belong to early ancestors, and not advanced enough to join later humans. It existed between categories that evolution had once seemed to keep distinct. After the basic skeletal proportions were established, researchers began detailed microscopic and biomechanical analysis. If the large-scale anatomy was confusing, the fine structure was even more so. Each surface of the bones recorded stresses created by repeated movements. These patterns acted like a long-term record of daily life, revealing what the species actually did rather than what it merely could do. The finger bones showed thick cortical bone along the inner curve, evidence of frequent powerful gripping. This was not occasional climbing. The hands regularly supported body weight against vertical surfaces. Yet the same fingers displayed wear on the tips, consistent with repeated contact against small, hard objects. Such marks are often associated with manipulation of stones or other materials requiring precise handling. The thumb joint in particular attracted attention. Its saddle-shaped articulation allowed rotation across multiple angles, a prerequisite for forceful pinch grip. In modern humans, this movement enables controlled pressure when shaping tools or processing food. The strength of the joint suggested repetitive loading rather than accidental use. Even without tools found in the chamber, the hands appeared practiced. Next, the forearm bones were examined for torsion resistance. Species that throw projectiles or swing objects develop characteristic reinforcement patterns. Homo naledi showed moderate resistance, more than tree-dwelling primates, but less than later humans. This implied occasional forceful arm movement, but not habitual long-range throwing. Their manual activities likely involved close-range manipulation rather than hunting with thrown weapons. The shoulder blade orientation confirmed extensive overhead reach. The glenoid cavity faced upward more than forward, enabling the arm to extend above the head efficiently. This configuration increases climbing efficiency but reduces endurance running stability. Yet the leg bones contradicted a climbing-dominant lifestyle. Femur cross-sections displayed reinforcement along the lower shaft, typical of repetitive upright walking. The knee joint locked in full extension, conserving energy during long-distance travel. Combined with foot arches capable of absorbing impact, the species clearly moved extensively across ground terrain. The contradiction suggested a dual adaptation rather than a transitional compromise. They were not gradually abandoning trees for land. They were fully capable in both environments at the same time. Such specialization in two opposing locomotion modes is rare because each normally trades off efficiency in the other. To understand daily activity, scientists analyzed bone isotope ratios. Chemical signatures preserved in the bones indicated diet composition and environment. Results showed consumption of both woodland and open grassland resources. The species likely moved between ecological zones regularly, rather than occupying a single niche. This flexibility may have reduced competition with other hominins sharing the region. The teeth revealed microscopic pits and scratches produced by chewing. The pattern did not match strict herbivores or carnivores. Instead, it resembled opportunistic omnivores, consuming whatever resources were seasonally available. Small animals, roots, nuts, and possibly insects contributed to survival. Such behavior aligns with a species relying on adaptability rather than specialization. The ear bones provided unexpected evidence about balance and movement speed. Semicircular canals were sized for controlled walking rather than rapid sprinting. They could run if necessary, but were optimized for endurance travel. This suggests foraging ranges extending far from home areas, requiring navigation, memory, and group coordination. Growth analysis of long bones revealed a developmental pace slower than that of apes. Individuals matured over extended periods, implying prolonged dependency on caregivers. Extended childhood generally supports learning through observation and social interaction. Even without advanced language, repeated exposure to group behavior can transmit complex habits across generations. One of the most debated features involved the brain's relative organization. Although absolute size was small, certain regions associated with hand coordination and social perception occupied larger proportions than expected. This did not equal human cognition, but indicated capacity beyond simple instinct-driven reactions. Cooperative behavior, route learning, and possibly shared routines were plausible. The pelvis reinforced upright posture, but retained some primitive muscle attachment patterns. Hip abductors were arranged to stabilize side-to-side movement during walking. However, muscle leverage suggested greater flexibility than modern humans, aiding climbing stability. The species balanced stability and mobility rather than optimizing only one. The spine curvature also showed intermediate traits. Lower vertebrae formed a lumbar curve supporting upright stance, yet upper vertebrae allowed torso twisting, beneficial for climbing or maneuvering through dense vegetation. This dual capability again indicated environmental versatility. Researchers then simulated gait using digital reconstructions. The walking pattern resembled a modern human stride, but slightly shorter. Energy expenditure per distance was efficient, meaning the species could travel long distances without excessive fatigue. This contradicted the idea of a primarily tree-dependent animal. If they moved widely across landscapes, they would encounter other hominin groups. That raised the question of interaction. Did they avoid others, compete, or coexist peacefully? No direct skeletal evidence of conflict appeared on the bones. Fractures matched accidental falls rather than weapon injuries. Coexistence without frequent violence seemed plausible. However, coexistence brings cultural implications. Observing another species use fire or tools could inspire imitation. Even without full understanding, repetition of observed actions could spread behaviors. Homo naledi's anatomy supported such imitation. Their hands could replicate movements, and their extended childhood allowed learning through repeated exposure. Another subtle detail emerged from foot pressure distribution. The big toe aligned forward and bore significant weight during push-off, identical to modern human walking. This adaptation appears only when a species relies heavily on terrestrial travel. Arboreal species retain grasping toes. Homo naledi had permanently committed to upright walking despite retaining climbing ability. Bone density patterns also revealed relatively low body fat storage. Individuals likely depended on consistent movement to obtain food. Seasonal shortages would require mobility rather than hoarding. Such reliance on group coordination increases social dependency, strengthening bonds and shared behaviors. By combining all biomechanical data, scientists formed a picture not of a primitive survivor, but of a specialized generalist. Homo naledi was adapted to multiple habitats, capable of varied movement and reliant on cooperation. The only missing element from a human-like lifestyle was large brain volume. This forced reconsideration of evolutionary assumptions. Perhaps cognitive complexity arose from interaction networks rather than individual brain capacity. A group sharing learned behaviors might function effectively even if individuals possessed modest intelligence. Over generations, routines could become tradition without symbolic thought. The skeleton no longer represented a halfway stage between ape and human. It represented an alternative strategy. Instead of expanding brain size first and behavior later, this lineage may have developed behavior through social structure and environmental necessity, with brain enlargement not required. The anatomical study ended not with classification, but with a challenge. Human evolution was no longer a single ladder climbed step by step. It appeared to be a landscape of different solutions to survival. Homo naledi demonstrated that walking like us, using hands like us, and possibly acting with intention did not automatically require thinking like us. With anatomy alone unable to place the species neatly in the human family tree, researchers turned to comparative analysis. The question was simple in theory. If Homo naledi did not fit clearly among known ancestors, perhaps direct comparison to each major human relative would reveal its closest relationship. The first comparison was with Homo sapiens. At a glance, certain features overlapped. The feet were almost identical. The lower limbs supported efficient upright walking. The teeth were reduced and generalized rather than specialized. But the similarities ended quickly. The skull volume was far smaller, the brow ridge more pronounced, and the face projected forward more than in modern humans. The pelvis proportions also differed subtly, reflecting differences in muscle attachment and stride mechanics. More importantly, the brain shape differed in proportion. Modern humans have expanded frontal regions associated with abstract thought and planning. Homo naledi showed limited expansion in those same areas, even though they were more developed than expected for its size. The gap was not merely quantitative, but structural. The organization resembled a simpler version of the human pattern, not a direct precursor. Next came Neanderthals. These were robust humans with large brains and heavy skeletal builds, adapted to cold climates. Homo naledi shared none of the environmental adaptations. Limb proportions were slender rather than stocky. The rib cage lacked the barrel shape typical of Neanderthals. Facial bones were smaller and less projecting. Despite living during overlapping periods, the two species represented completely different survival strategies. Denisovans posed another puzzle. Known mainly from genetic data and fragmentary fossils, they existed in Asia and interbred with modern humans. But genetic testing required preserved DNA, and the cave environment did not protect organic molecules well enough. Without DNA evidence, only anatomy could guide comparison. The few Denisovan bones known were larger and more robust than Naledi remains, suggesting little direct relation. The most logical comparison seemed Homo erectus, an earlier, widespread species known for upright walking and tool use. Certain features matched. The cranial shape had similarities in its long, low profile. The brow ridge showed partial resemblance. Yet Homo erectus possessed a significantly larger brain and lacked the strongly curved finger bones, indicating heavy climbing. It was adapted primarily to terrestrial life, unlike the mixed adaptations seen here. Even older species, such as Australopithecines, were examined. They had small brains and climbing adaptations, but their feet and legs were not as specialized for efficient walking. Their pelvis structure differed as well. Homo naledi's locomotion was too advanced to belong comfortably among them. Every comparison produced partial matches, but never a complete fit. Each known human relative shared some traits while contradicting others. Instead of branching from one specific ancestor, the species seemed to borrow characteristics across evolutionary time. This led to a radical possibility. The human family tree might not resemble a tree at all. Instead of a single trunk dividing into branches, it might resemble a braided river where populations separate and rejoin repeatedly. Traits could move between groups through interbreeding or parallel adaptation. Homo naledi could represent one of these side channels, preserving ancient traits while acquiring newer ones independently. But if interbreeding occurred, genetic evidence should exist. Unfortunately, DNA extraction attempts failed repeatedly due to mineral infiltration within the bones. Without genetic confirmation, the species remained defined purely by morphology, leaving its relationships speculative. Scientists then examined developmental timing. In humans, skull growth continues long after birth, allowing brain expansion during childhood. In more primitive species, skull growth ends earlier. Homo naledi displayed an intermediate pattern. Growth extended longer than apes, but shorter than modern humans. This again placed it between categories rather than within one. The auditory system offered additional insight. Ear structure suggested sensitivity to mid-range frequencies similar to human speech patterns, though not identical. This implied vocal communication more complex than simple calls, but not necessarily full language. Combined with prolonged childhood, social learning likely played a strong role in survival. Tool associations were revisited through regional archaeology. Nearby sites contained stone tools dated to similar periods. While not found in the chamber itself, they showed that tool-using species lived in the same area. Whether Naledi made them or observed their makers remained unknown. Its hand anatomy allowed tool creation, but absence of direct evidence prevented certainty. The geographic distribution also mattered. Fossils were confined to a limited region rather than widespread across continents like Homo erectus. This suggested a localized population surviving in a specific ecological niche. Isolation could preserve ancient traits, while environmental pressure encouraged selective modern features. If Homo naledi lived alongside modern humans, interaction becomes unavoidable. Shared water sources, hunting grounds, and shelter areas would overlap. Over thousands of years, occasional cultural exchange or competition might occur, yet the fossil record showed no sign of rapid replacement. The species endured for extended periods, indicating successful adaptation rather than marginal survival. The deeper the comparisons went, the clearer a pattern emerged. Homo naledi did not represent a missing link between ape and human. Instead, it represented a parallel experiment. While one lineage expanded brain size dramatically, another maintained smaller brains but refined body efficiency and social cooperation. This interpretation transformed the significance of the discovery. Human evolution was no longer about a single species gradually becoming more intelligent while others faded away. It became a story of multiple human forms exploring different strategies simultaneously. Some emphasized cognition, others mobility, others adaptability. Homo naledi demonstrated that the qualities often used to define humanity could arise in combinations previously unimagined. Upright walking, dexterous hands, cooperative behavior, and even possible treatment of the dead did not necessarily depend on a large brain appearing first. They could develop through different evolutionary pathways. By the end of comparison studies, the species remained scientifically isolated. It belonged to the genus Homo, but to no clear branch within it. Its existence suggested that many human relatives may have lived and vanished without leaving enough fossils to reveal their stories. The family tree was likely far more crowded than previously believed. As comparative anatomy failed to anchor the species to a single lineage, researchers began modeling evolutionary scenarios instead of searching for a direct ancestor. Rather than asking which species produced Homo naledi, they asked what sequence of environmental pressures could produce such a combination of traits. The southern African landscape, around 300,000 years ago, alternated between woodland patches and open grassland corridors. Climate fluctuations repeatedly expanded and shrank forested areas. A population living in this region would benefit from mobility and versatility rather than specialization. The anatomy of Homo naledi matched this environment precisely. It could travel efficiently across open ground, yet still climb for safety or food when necessary. This ecological flexibility offered a survival advantage. Larger-brained species often require more calories to sustain neural tissue. During periods of scarcity, a smaller brain consumes less energy, allowing survival on limited resources. If Homo naledi relied on learned routines rather than high-level problem-solving, it might endure conditions that challenged more cognitively demanding species. Such reasoning suggested that intelligence does not evolve simply toward greater complexity, but toward balance with environment. In stable, resource-rich areas, brain expansion may thrive. In fluctuating environments, efficiency may dominate. Homo naledi could represent a lineage where energetic economy outweighed cognitive expansion. Scientists then explored the possibility of long-term coexistence among several human species occupying different ecological roles. Modern humans might dominate tool-dependent hunting niches. Other hominins could specialize in scavenging or plant gathering. Homo naledi, with its mobility and adaptability, may have occupied transitional zones between habitats, reducing direct competition. Evidence supporting coexistence came from regional fossil layers showing multiple species within overlapping time frames. Rather than replacing each other immediately, populations likely interacted across generations. Competition alone could not explain their persistence. Niche separation appeared more consistent with the data. The next challenge was explaining behavioral complexity with a small brain. One theory proposed distributed cognition. In this model, intelligence emerges from group interaction rather than individual capacity. Repeated behaviors become tradition through imitation. Over time, actions appear intentional, even if individuals understand only parts of the process. For example, if one generation carried bodies into a cave to avoid predators attracted by scent, younger members might repeat the behavior without knowing its origin. The act becomes cultural rather than instinctive. Eventually, it resembles ritual, though it began as practicality. Such transmission requires memory and social bonds, but not abstract reasoning. The chamber's repeated use fits this model. Individuals did not need symbolic beliefs about death. They only needed to follow learned patterns reinforced by group behavior. The cave became a consistent destination across generations, not because of spiritual meaning, but because it was what their group always did. Another theory suggested cognitive specialization rather than general intelligence. Certain brain regions in Homo naledi appeared organized for spatial navigation and coordination. These abilities might support complex tasks like navigating dark passages while lacking advanced language or abstract thought. In this view, intelligence evolves in modules responding to survival challenges rather than expanding uniformly. The absence of complex tools in the chamber did not necessarily contradict this. The species might rely on environmental familiarity rather than manufactured objects. If they knew safe routes and reliable food sources, they could survive without technological escalation. Some researchers considered hybridization events in distant ancestry. If earlier hominin species interbred, traits could recombine unpredictably. Over thousands of years, selective pressures might preserve a unique mixture unlike any parent population. Without DNA evidence, this remains speculative but consistent with the mosaic anatomy. Geographic isolation could reinforce such mixtures. A valley or plateau separated by terrain barriers might limit gene flow enough to preserve unusual combinations while still allowing occasional contact. Over long periods, the population would appear distinct, yet not completely unrelated to neighbors. To test movement patterns, scientists analyzed strontium isotopes in tooth enamel. These chemical signatures reflect the geology of regions where individuals grew up. Results indicated that members of the species occupied a consistent local area rather than migrating across vast distances. This stability supported the idea of a localized population adapted to a particular ecological niche. Social structure also came under examination. The presence of individuals of various ages in the chamber suggested group living rather than solitary behavior. Cooperative species often survive longer in fluctuating environments. Group protection, shared knowledge of food sources, and coordinated movement increase survival probability even without advanced technology. The question then shifted from classification to significance. If Homo naledi existed alongside early modern humans, the uniqueness of our lineage diminished. Instead of a single species developing complex behavior and replacing all others, multiple human forms might have explored different adaptive strategies simultaneously. This realization altered how anthropologists interpreted other fragmentary fossils worldwide. Bones previously dismissed as abnormal individuals might represent undiscovered populations with similarly mixed traits. The evolutionary record could be incomplete not because fossils failed to form, but because researchers expected too simple a pattern. By constructing ecological and behavioral models, Homo naledi became less an anomaly and more a demonstration of diversity. Evolution does not produce a straight progression toward a final form. It produces many experiments, most temporary, some overlapping, each shaped by local conditions. The species' greatest impact was conceptual. It challenged the assumption that human-like behavior required human-like cognition. Cooperative action, consistent treatment of the dead, and environmental adaptability could arise from social continuity rather than intellectual abstraction. As studies continued, Homo naledi stood as a reminder that intelligence may not be measured only by brain size or tool complexity. Sometimes survival depends on stability of behavior rather than innovation. And in that sense, this small-brained population succeeded long enough to share the world with early members of our own species, leaving behind evidence that evolution had taken more than one path toward being human. If anatomy created uncertainty, dating created outright contradiction. The physical structure of Homo naledi strongly resembled early members of the genus Homo that lived nearly 2 million years ago. Yet, the geological context suggested something far more recent. Determining the age of the remains became critical because their place in time would decide whether they were ancestors, relatives, or an isolated survival. The cave environment complicated standard dating methods. There were no volcanic ash layers above or below the fossils, which normally allow precise radiometric measurement. Instead, researchers relied on multiple, indirect techniques, each measuring a different part of the cave's history, rather than the bones alone. One method examined uranium decay within thin mineral crusts that formed on the bones after burial. When groundwater seeps through limestone, it deposits minerals containing uranium. Over time, the uranium decays into thorium at a predictable rate. By measuring this ratio, scientists could determine when the crust formed, giving a minimum age for the remains beneath it. Another method analyzed the sediments surrounding the bones. Tiny quartz grains accumulate trapped electrons from natural background radiation. Exposure to light releases these electrons, resetting the clock. By measuring how many electrons remained, researchers estimated how long the grains had been buried in darkness. This technique, called luminescence dating, provided an age range for the sediment layers. Finally, direct dating was attempted on the teeth using electron spin resonance. This measured radiation damage accumulated in tooth enamel over time. Because enamel forms in childhood and remains stable, it preserves a record of exposure since the individual lived. Each method carried uncertainties. Mineral crusts could form long after burial. Sediments might shift slightly. Groundwater chemistry could alter measurements. For this reason, multiple techniques were applied independently to compare results. If they converged on similar numbers, confidence increased. The first results surprised researchers. Instead of ages approaching 1 million years or more, the measurements consistently clustered between about 230 and 330,000 years ago. Repeated testing confirmed the range. The fossils were not ancient relics from the early stages of human evolution. They lived during the same period as emerging Homo sapiens populations in Africa. This produced a temporal paradox. Creatures with bodies resembling distant ancestors coexisted with early modern humans capable of sophisticated tools and perhaps symbolic behavior. Traditional models assumed older forms gradually disappeared as newer forms replaced them. Yet here was evidence of overlap lasting tens of thousands of years. To verify the conclusion, scientists dated different bones from different individuals. If the chamber represented a single catastrophic event, all remains would share a narrow date. Instead, ages varied within the same general period, suggesting repeated depositions across generations rather than one moment in time. The cave itself helped preserve this record. Because the chamber was isolated, sediments accumulated slowly without disturbance. Each new body lay atop earlier remains, separated by thin mineral layers. Over centuries, the chamber recorded a sequence rather than a single occurrence. Researchers compared these dates with climate records from nearby lake sediments and ice cores. The time range corresponded to fluctuating climates with alternating wetter and drier phases. Human populations expanded and contracted across the landscape during these changes. Homo naledi survived through these cycles, indicating resilience rather than marginal existence. The dating also meant that advanced stone tool technologies already existed nearby. Archaeological sites in southern Africa from the same period contain carefully shaped points and blades attributed to early Homo sapiens or related populations. If Homo naledi encountered these groups, the technological contrast would have been significant. Some scientists proposed that the bones might have been redeposited from older layers into younger sediments, explaining the mismatch between anatomy and age. Detailed examination rejected this. The bones lacked abrasion marks expected from transport. They rested in natural articulation positions consistent with decomposition where they were found. The consistency across dating methods strengthened confidence in the young age. Each technique measured a different process, yet all converged within the same range. The conclusion became unavoidable. A small-brained species with primitive traits lived alongside our own early species. This forced re-evaluation of extinction assumptions. Rather than one species replacing another immediately, multiple hominin populations shared environments for extended periods. Some may have specialized in different resources, reducing competition enough to coexist, the implication extended beyond classification. If Homo naledi survived into relatively recent times, their behavior might have been influenced by neighboring species. Cultural contact becomes possible only when populations overlap in time. The dating opened the door to interactions previously considered impossible. The paradox deepened the mystery of the chamber. If advanced humans lived nearby, why did Homo naledi continue its unique practices? Either the groups remained separate with minimal contact, or each maintained distinct traditions despite proximity. Both possibilities indicated a more complex prehistoric world than a simple succession of species. The chronological evidence transformed the discovery from a curious anatomical variant into a fundamental challenge to evolutionary narratives. The story was no longer about a primitive ancestor preserved in isolation. It was about diversity in humanity, persisting far later than expected, sharing landscapes, and perhaps influencing each other in ways the fossil record only hints at. Even after multiple dating methods converged on the same time range, skepticism remained strong within the scientific community. The implications were simply too disruptive. A species with a brain barely larger than that of a chimpanzee, living at the same time as early Homo sapiens, challenged decades of established interpretation. For many researchers, the burden of proof had to be extremely high. To address this, independent laboratories repeated measurements using new samples taken from different parts of the chamber. If contamination or chemical alteration had affected earlier results, the new tests would produce different ages. Instead, they fell within the same general window. Each repetition strengthened the conclusion that the fossils were indeed relatively recent. Geologists then studied how the cave itself formed. Limestone caves change slowly over time as groundwater dissolves rock. The Naledi chamber's narrow passages showed no signs of recent collapse or opening that could have introduced younger sediments into an older deposit. Mineral layers grew gradually and uninterrupted. This confirmed that the chamber remained sealed during the period when the bodies accumulated. Researchers also examined nearby fossil sites for comparison. Other caves in the same region contained clearly older species with matching ancient ages. Their mineral coatings differed in chemical composition from those on the Naledi bones. If the remains had been reworked from older deposits, their mineral signatures would match those older caves. They did not. The chemistry corresponded only to the later time period. Attention then turned to the broader timeline of human evolution in Africa. Around 300,000 years ago, early Homo sapiens populations were developing new technologies, including refined stone points and possibly hafted tools. Evidence of controlled fire use was common. Some sites even hinted at early symbolic markings. The contrast between these behaviors and the small brain anatomy of Homo naledi intensified the paradox. Yet coexistence between different human species was not unprecedented. Neanderthals and modern humans overlapped in Europe for thousands of years. Denisovans overlapped with both in Asia. The difference lay in cognitive expectations. Neanderthals had brains as large as or larger than ours. Homo naledi did not. Its survival, alongside technologically capable humans, raised the question of how it maintained its niche. One explanation involved environmental partitioning. If Homo naledi focused on resources overlooked by other species, competition would be minimal. Its climbing ability might allow access to tree-based foods unavailable to fully terrestrial humans. Its efficient walking would enable travel across patchy habitats. Instead of direct competition, each species exploited different opportunities within the same landscape. Another possibility involved nocturnal or low-light activity. The anatomy of the inner ear and body proportions suggested stability in uneven terrain. If the species moved during dawn, dusk, or night, encounters with other hominins might be infrequent. Their familiarity with caves would provide shelter during dangerous hours. Such behavioral separation reduces conflict even when territories overlap. The dating also influenced interpretation of the chamber itself. Earlier theories proposed that a primitive ancestor accidentally accumulated in the cave long before humans appeared. Now the chamber existed within a populated world of multiple intelligent species. The repeated placement of bodies could no longer be dismissed as ancient instinct alone. It occurred in a time when varied behavioral strategies already existed. Researchers considered whether Homo naledi might have learned certain actions through observation of neighboring groups. Even limited imitation could spread behaviors such as returning to a consistent location with the dead. Cultural diffusion does not require full comprehension. Repetition over generations stabilizes the action until it appears traditional. However, there was no direct evidence of tool sharing or artifact exchange. The chamber contained only bones and natural sediments. This absence suggested that even if contact occurred, each species retained distinct habits. Homo naledi's behavior remained uniquely its own, neither identical to modern humans nor purely animal. As confidence in the dating solidified, textbooks required revision. The previous model imagined a gradual replacement where older forms disappeared as newer ones emerged. The new evidence showed a mosaic world where diverse humans coexisted for long periods. Evolution looked less like a sequence and more like a community. The paradox also affected how intelligence was interpreted. If a small-brained species persisted successfully in a world with larger-brained competitors, intelligence alone did not determine survival. Adaptability, cooperation, and ecological fit mattered just as much. Evolution favored whatever combination allowed persistence, not necessarily what appeared most advanced. By the end of the dating debate, the scientific question had shifted. The age of Homo naledi was no longer disputed. Instead, attention moved to understanding how such a species functioned socially and behaviorally within a complex environment shared with other humans. The timeline was secure, but its meaning remained open. The chamber, once thought to preserve relics from a distant past, now represented a moment in a crowded human landscape. Different kinds of humans walked the same ground, breathed the same air, and perhaps occasionally saw one another across the same valleys. The mystery was no longer when they lived, but how they lived together without one immediately erasing the other. With the age confirmed and anatomy mapped, the most difficult question remained. How could a species with such a small brain perform behaviors that appeared organized and deliberate? The chamber suggested repeated body placement. That required cooperation, memory, and coordinated action. Traditional thinking linked such behavior to larger brains. Homo naledi did not fit that rule. To explore this, researchers examined the internal structure of the skull more closely. Although total volume was small, the relative proportions of certain regions differed from apes. Areas associated with motor planning and hand control were expanded compared to other species of similar size. This meant the brain might be specialized rather than simple. Instead of doing many things moderately well, it might do certain tasks very efficiently. Modern neuroscience shows that intelligence is not only about size, but also connectivity. Dense neural connections can allow complex patterns to emerge even in smaller brains. If Homo naledi had highly efficient networks supporting spatial awareness and coordinated movement, it could navigate dark caves and carry objects without requiring abstract reasoning. The structure of the inner ear reinforced this idea. Balance organs suggested fine control during slow, careful movement, not rapid escape climbing. Navigating tight passages in darkness demands body awareness and communication within a group. Individuals must adjust pace, avoid collisions, and maintain direction. These are not instinctive reactions, but learned coordination patterns. Another aspect considered was emotional response. Brain size does not strictly determine capacity for social attachment. Many animals form bonds and react to loss. If Homo naledi lived in cooperative groups, the death of a member could disrupt stability. Moving the body away from living space may have been part of maintaining group order rather than symbolic mourning. Evidence of care within the species appeared in the bones themselves. Some individuals survived injuries that would limit movement temporarily. Healing indicated that others tolerated slower members instead of abandoning them. Such tolerance reflects social cohesion, which supports coordinated behaviors. The hands again provided clues. Precision grip capability suggests frequent manipulation of objects. Even if stone tools were not preserved, individuals could have used wood or plant materials that left no fossil trace. Handling objects regularly builds neural pathways supporting coordinated action. Carrying bodies would not be an entirely new task, but an extension of everyday manipulation. Researchers then examined possible fire use. Although direct evidence inside the chamber remained uncertain, nearby passages contained discolorations consistent with soot. If controlled fire provided light, even briefly, individuals could navigate intentionally rather than blindly. Learning to maintain a small flame does not require complex reasoning if taught through repetition. Behavioral experiments with modern humans demonstrated that complex routes can be memorized without language using only movement sequences. After enough repetition, individuals navigate automatically. Homo naledi might have known the path as a learned pattern rather than an abstract map. The emerging picture was not of a primitive creature suddenly performing advanced acts. Instead, it was of a species whose social structure produced consistent behavior over generations. Small brains, limited innovation, but did not prevent stability. The chamber practice could persist for centuries without anyone understanding its original purpose. This interpretation shifted the meaning of intelligence. Instead of measuring capacity for invention, scientists considered reliability of learned behavior. Homo naledi may not have invented rituals, but it maintained tradition. Its cognition lay in remembering and repeating rather than conceptualizing. The bones therefore recorded not a single dramatic event, but a long cultural habit. Each individual placed in the chamber represented participation in a pattern older than themselves. The action required cooperation and memory, but not necessarily symbolism. Complexity emerged from continuity, not from sudden intellectual leaps. After the idea of learned routine gained support, scientists investigated whether any evidence pointed beyond practical disposal toward awareness of death itself. The distinction mattered. Removing a body for safety is different from recognizing death as a permanent state. One is survival behavior. The other approaches cognition associated with symbolic thought. Researchers first analyzed body positioning. Many skeletal elements remained close to natural anatomical order. Limbs had not been disarticulated before deposition. This indicated that individuals were carried soon after death, rather than long after decomposition. Waiting for decay would reduce effort, yet the bodies entered intact. This choice suggested a preference rather than mere convenience. Sediment patterns around some remains hinted at gentle placement, coordinated movement, and attention to orientation. Even if not symbolic, it demonstrated awareness that the body was still socially significant immediately after death. The lack of tool marks on bones confirmed that no preparation occurred beforehand. The group did not modify the body, but simply transported it. The simplicity of the act again suggested structured routine rather than elaborate ceremony. By combining these observations, scientists concluded that Homo naledi likely recognized death as a change requiring response, even if not conceptually understood. Their brains may not have formed abstract ideas about mortality, but their behavior reflected consistent treatment of the deceased. This finding carried profound implications. The origins of practices surrounding death might precede symbolic thought. Instead of rituals emerging suddenly with modern humans, they may have grown gradually from practical and emotional behaviors repeated over generations. The chamber therefore recorded not only anatomy, but the beginnings of social tradition. A small brained species followed a shared pattern whenever a member died. The act required memory, cooperation, and emotional sensitivity. Intelligence, in this context, was expressed through continuity of behavior rather than invention of meaning. Homo naledi did not leave art or language to explain its intentions, yet, through repeated action, it left a trace of social awareness embedded in stone and bone. By this stage of research, the fossils no longer posed a single mystery, but several competing explanations. Each explained part of the evidence, yet failed to resolve all of it. Scientists organized these possibilities into formal theories, testing how well each accounted for anatomy, age, environment, and behavior. The first theory proposed long isolation. In this view, Homo naledi descended from an early human ancestor that became geographically separated from other populations for hundreds of thousands of years. Cut off from major evolutionary pressures affecting other groups, it retained primitive traits while slowly adapting to local conditions. Its small brain persisted because larger cognitive capacity offered no advantage in its particular habitat. Isolation can preserve ancient characteristics. Certain island animals retain body plans long after mainland relatives change. However, the cave site lay in mainland Africa, not a remote island. Complete separation over such long periods would require barriers preventing interaction with nearby species. Geological evidence did not show such barriers remaining stable long enough, and refined hand grip suggested relatively recent adaptation. Isolation alone could not easily produce a combination of both ancient and advanced characteristics. The theory explained survival, but not the anatomical mixture. The second theory suggested a surviving primitive lineage. Rather than isolation, this idea proposed that older human forms did not disappear when newer ones appeared. Instead, they continued existing alongside them in reduced populations. Homo naledi would represent one of these long-lasting branches, maintaining a stable ecological role while others evolved differently. This explanation fit the coexistence timeline well. Other human species, such as Neanderthals, survived long periods beside modern humans. However, the anatomical evidence again complicated matters. Homo naledi did not simply resemble a known earlier species. It displayed unique proportions not matching any direct ancestor. If it were a surviving branch, its anatomy should closely match its origin species. Instead, it appeared modified in multiple directions. The third theory proposed hybrid ancestry. In this scenario, distant hominin populations interbred in the past, combining traits unpredictably. Over generations, natural selection preserved combinations suited to local survival, producing a stable yet unusual form. Hybridization is common in evolution and can produce mosaic anatomy. The challenge lay in proof. Without recoverable DNA, hybrid origin could not be confirmed. Bone structure alone cannot determine genetic mixing. Yet, the theory explained why traits from different evolutionary stages appeared together. It also accounted for moderate adaptation rather than extreme specialization. Still, some scientists argued the degree of mixture seemed too consistent to result from random recombination alone. Another possibility involved cultural dependence. Homo naledi might have relied on behavioral knowledge learned from neighboring species instead of evolving its own solutions. Observing fire use, movement patterns, or resource-gathering strategies could reduce pressure for brain expansion. Social imitation might replace biological change. This theory addressed the behavioral paradox but left anatomy unexplained. Learning from others does not alter bone structure significantly. The modern human, like foot and precise hand joints, required long-term evolutionary pressure rather than borrowed behavior. Cultural influence could shape habits but not skeletal design. A fifth theory focused on ecological specialization. Homo naledi may have occupied a niche requiring endurance walking, occasional climbing, and cooperative behavior without technological complexity. In such a niche, large brains could be energetically wasteful. Selection would favor efficiency over cognition. The species would stabilize around its unique combination of traits because they fit the environment precisely. This explanation aligned well with isotope evidence showing mixed habitat use. It also matched the persistence across climate changes. However, critics noted that ecological niches rarely remain unchanged for hundreds of thousands of years. Environmental variation typically forces adaptation or extinction. The consistency of Homo naledi's form suggested additional factors preserving it. Researchers compared all theories against the cave behavior. Repeated body placement implied social structure resistant to change. Traditions can stabilize populations by reinforcing cooperation. If individuals relied heavily on learned routines, cultural continuity might buffer environmental shifts. This could allow a species to persist longer than expected without rapid biological change. Gradually, scientists realized no single theory fully explained the species. Instead, several mechanisms likely operated together. Partial isolation could limit gene flow. Occasional contact could introduce traits. Ecological balance could maintain body proportions. Social tradition could reinforce survival strategies. The debate moved away from choosing one explanation toward understanding interaction among them. Homo naledi might represent a population shaped by multiple subtle forces rather than a dramatic evolutionary event. Its uniqueness came not from a single cause, but from overlapping influences acting over long periods. This perspective changed how anthropologists approach the fossil record. Rather than searching for simple linear descent, they began modeling networks of populations interacting through time. Homo naledi became a case study showing that evolutionary outcomes emerge from complexity rather than direct progression. After years of debate, researchers began combining the competing theories into a layered explanation rather than treating them as mutually exclusive. Instead of asking which single cause produced Homo naledi, they examined how several moderate influences could reinforce one another across long periods of time. The starting point was geography. Southern Africa during this period was not a uniform landscape, but a patchwork of habitats separated by rivers, ridges, and changing vegetation. These features did not form permanent barriers, yet they could slow migration enough to keep populations partially distinct. A group living within one cluster of valleys might interact only occasionally with neighboring groups. This level of separation allows differences to accumulate without complete isolation. Within such a semi-connected network, occasional interbreeding can introduce new traits without erasing existing ones. Over many generations, natural selection preserves combinations that function well locally. The result is not a direct descendant of one ancestor, but a stabilized mixture. This helps explain why Homo naledi carried traits resembling several earlier species without matching any exactly. Ecology then shaped which traits endured. The region's fluctuating climate rewarded flexibility. Individuals able to travel long distances for scattered resources survived dry phases, while climbing ability provided access to sheltered food during wetter periods. Large brains require consistent high-calorie diets, but unstable environments favor energy efficiency. A smaller brain paired with reliable movement could outlast more demanding physiology. Social behavior reinforced this stability. Cooperative groups reduce individual risk. Knowledge about routes, safe shelters, and seasonal food spreads through imitation. When survival depends on repeating effective patterns rather than inventing new ones, tradition becomes more valuable than innovation. A population guided by established routines changes slowly because change offers little advantage. The chamber practice fit naturally within this framework. Removing the dead to a consistent location prevented predators and illness while maintaining group cohesion. Over generations, the behavior became a fixed rule. Because it worked, there was no pressure to replace it with more complex alternatives. Cultural continuity replaced biological change as the primary stabilizing force. Another important factor involved competition. Larger-brained species such as early Homo sapiens likely focused on tool-dependent hunting strategies. That lifestyle demands planning, cooperation in pursuit, and often territorial control. Homo naledi's generalized foraging and mobility would overlap less with such activities. Instead of competing directly, the two species may have used the same land differently. Indirect evidence supports this idea. No injuries consistent with repeated violent encounters appear on the Naledi bones. Populations sharing resources without heavy conflict often occupy slightly different niches. The survival of Homo naledi for thousands of years alongside other humans suggests a balance rather than displacement. Researchers also explored developmental timing. Prolonged childhood allows extensive learning but slows reproduction. Rapid reproduction allows faster population recovery but limits learning time. Homo naledi showed an intermediate pattern. This balance may have suited a stable, tradition-based society. Young individuals learned essential roots and behaviors before maturity, while still maintaining steady population replacement. Neurological modeling suggested that consistent environments reward memory over problem-solving. If daily survival relies on remembering reliable paths and actions, neural organization prioritizes repetition. Expansion of abstract reasoning centers offers limited benefit. The brain remains small but efficient in its specialized tasks. The combination of semi-isolation, occasional contact, ecological balance, and cultural stability produced a feedback loop. Each factor supported the others. Limited contact preserved distinctive anatomy. Stable habits reduce pressure for cognitive expansion. Efficient physiology maintains survival during climate shifts. Over time, the population remained recognizable without dramatic change. The discovery forced reconsideration of the role of intelligence in survival. Large brains require significant energy. Maintaining them demands reliable food sources and complex social organization. For modern humans, technological skill compensates for that cost. But Homo naledi showed that a species could succeed without that investment. Efficient movement, flexible diet, and cooperative routine could balance environmental challenges just as effectively in certain conditions. Anthropologists began comparing this to other evolutionary patterns. In many animal groups, the most complex species are not always the most persistent. Some survive by specialization, others by simplicity. Human evolution appeared to follow the same principle. Intelligence was one strategy among many, not the inevitable goal. This realization altered interpretation of earlier fossils as well. Previously, small-brained hominins found in younger layers were sometimes dismissed as abnormal individuals or misidentified specimens. Homo naledi suggested that genuine small-brained populations might have existed far later than assumed. The fossil record might be incomplete, not because they vanished early, but because their remains were rarely preserved or recognized. The coexistence model also changed how migration was understood. Instead of waves of replacement, different human groups may have overlapped across landscapes, interacting occasionally but maintaining distinct identities. Cultural exchange could occur without genetic merging. Observing another species did not require becoming that species. This raised questions about early Homo sapiens behavior. If they encountered other human-like beings, their perception of humanity itself would differ from ours. Modern humans define themselves as unique, but early humans lived in a world where multiple forms of humanity were visible. Their social awareness evolved within diversity rather than isolation. Homo naledi's possible body placement behavior gained new meaning in this context. It indicated that structured social practices might have developed independently in separate populations. Cultural behaviors did not originate once and spread everywhere. They could arise repeatedly under similar social pressures. The implication extended to language origins. If coordinated group actions can exist without full symbolic communication, early stages of language might have begun as structured signals supporting routine activities. Complex grammar could evolve gradually from practical coordination rather than sudden invention. Researchers also reconsidered extinction patterns. Species often disappear when conditions change beyond their adaptive range. Homo naledi persisted through environmental fluctuations but eventually vanished. Its disappearance might reflect not inferiority, but shifting conditions favoring different strategies. Evolution selects for fit within specific contexts, not permanent superiority. The concept of human uniqueness, therefore, became less clear. Traits once considered defining humanity appeared in different combinations across species. Upright walking, cooperation, emotional response to death, and environmental adaptation were not exclusive to Homo sapiens. Our species combined them in a particular way, but others explored similar qualities separately. As the broader implications settled into scientific discussion, researchers began confronting a more philosophical question disguised as a biological one. If multiple human species once existed at the same time, what actually defines a human? For decades, the answer seemed straightforward: large brain, advanced tools, symbolic thought. Homo naledi complicated each of these criteria. It walked upright, with efficiency comparable to modern humans. It used its hands, with precision approaching tool-making capability. It likely cooperated in organized groups and responded consistently to death. Yet it lacked the brain volume traditionally considered necessary for such behavior. The definition of humanity could no longer rely on a single physical threshold. Anthropologists shifted toward behavioral definitions. Perhaps humanity emerged when groups maintained shared practices across generations. In this sense, the chamber behavior mattered deeply. Repetition of a learned action linking multiple generations creates continuity beyond individual instinct. It forms a social memory. Social memory differs from individual intelligence. A single member does not need to understand the full meaning of an action for the group to preserve it. Each participant contributes to maintaining the pattern. Over time, the group functions as a stable system larger than any individual mind. This concept explained how Homo naledi could display complex collective behavior without advanced cognition. The species may not have possessed abstract language, yet it could maintain a tradition. Human culture itself may have begun this way, gradually accumulating meaning long before individuals consciously interpreted it. The coexistence of several human species also suggested that awareness of difference might have existed. Early Homo sapiens encountering Homo naledi would have recognized similarity in posture and movement, but difference in appearance. Such encounters could shape social boundaries, cooperation, or avoidance. The origins of group identity might therefore predate modern humans alone. Another consequence involved technological development. If tool-making required certain cognitive thresholds, then species lacking those thresholds would rely more heavily on environmental knowledge. This reinforces stability rather than innovation. Homo naledi's persistence indicated that survival does not always reward constant invention. Sometimes reliable behavior is sufficient. The eventual disappearance of Homo naledi raised questions about vulnerability. Stability works until conditions shift too far. If climate or competition altered resource patterns beyond its adaptive range, its specialized balance might fail. Meanwhile, a species capable of flexible innovation could adjust more rapidly. Extinction, in this case, reflects changing context rather than inherent inadequacy. Researchers compared this to modern ecosystems, where generalist species survive moderate change, but specialists may thrive longer in stable niches. Homo naledi occupied a middle ground. It was versatile in movement, but conservative in behavior. This balance sustained it for long periods, but may have limited rapid adaptation when circumstances shifted dramatically. Scientists also questioned whether the chamber represented the only such location. The cave system contains multiple unexplored passages. If other chambers exist, they might hold additional remains or different patterns of placement. The current evidence may be only a fragment of a broader behavior repeated across the region. Diet remains another unresolved area. Chemical analysis revealed a varied intake but could not specify exact food sources. Understanding diet could clarify daily routines and movement ranges, which in turn might explain why this specific chamber held importance. If food resources clustered nearby, the chamber might have served a practical central point in their territory. Interaction with other hominins is equally uncertain. The dating confirms coexistence, but coexistence does not guarantee encounter. Fossil evidence of direct contact, such as shared tools or mixed habitation layers, has not been found. Without such evidence, whether they saw one another remains speculation. Language capacity also remains unknown. Vocal anatomy does not preserve well, and brain organization offers only indirect hints. They likely communicated through sound and gesture, but whether this reached structured language cannot be determined. The chamber behavior shows coordination, but not necessarily complex speech. The disappearance of the species remains perhaps the greatest question. No clear signs of violent conflict appear in the bones. No sudden environmental catastrophe aligns precisely with their final presence. They seem to fade from the record rather than ending abruptly. This gradual absence suggests changing conditions rather than single events. Climate shifts around the time show increasing variability. Resource distribution may have become less predictable. A strategy based on stable routines might fail under rapid change. Meanwhile, species capable of altering behavior quickly would expand. Over generations, the population could shrink without leaving dramatic evidence. Researchers continue to search nearby regions for younger remains that might extend their timeline. Each new discovery has potential to reshape conclusions. If later fossils appear, the coexistence period lengthens. If none appear, extinction timing becomes narrower. The current absence is informative but incomplete. The chamber itself also holds unanswered geological questions. Mineral formation rates suggest long intervals between depositions, yet the exact frequency cannot be measured precisely. Whether generations pass between events or only years remains uncertain. The difference changes interpretation of social continuity. Despite advanced imaging and modeling, the species' mental world remains inaccessible. We infer behavior from patterns, but cannot confirm motives. The temptation to interpret ritual or belief must be balanced against evidence. The fossils reveal action, not meaning. This limitation defines Paleoanthropology. The past is reconstructed through fragments, and every conclusion carries uncertainty. Homo naledi highlights this more strongly than most discoveries because it contradicts expectations at every step. Each answer generates new questions rather than closing discussion. Future technologies may offer clearer insight. Improved chemical analysis could detect traces of organic materials once carried with the bodies. New dating methods might refine deposition intervals. Additional sites could reveal daily living areas rather than only the place of the dead. For now, the species remains defined by absence as much as presence. We know where bodies were left, but not where they lived. We know they cooperated, but not what they understood. We know they persisted, but not why they vanished. The cave chamber therefore stands as both evidence and boundary. It shows that another kind of human once moved deliberately through darkness, yet it hides the reasons behind each step. The final challenge presented by Homo naledi is not technical but interpretive. Science seeks explanations that connect evidence into coherent narratives. Yet sometimes a discovery resists closure. The species forces researchers to accept uncertainty as part of understanding rather than a temporary obstacle. At the beginning of its study, the question was simple: where does it fit in the human family tree? After years of analysis, the better question became, how many different forms of humanity once existed that we have not yet found? The chamber may represent only one preserved example among many that left no trace. This realization changes expectations of the fossil record. Preservation requires specific conditions. A population living in open terrain leaves fewer remains than one near caves. If Homo naledi had not used this chamber repeatedly, its existence might never have been known. Entire branches of human diversity may have disappeared without evidence. The species also reminds researchers that behavior does not fossilize directly. We see only outcomes. A body placed in a chamber suggests intention, but intention itself remains invisible. Scientific interpretation must remain cautious, acknowledging what can be inferred and what cannot. Despite this caution, the discovery expands understanding of cognitive evolution. Intelligence need not emerge suddenly with symbolic art or advanced tools. It may begin as reliable coordination and shared memory. Over long periods, simple, repeated actions can become structured tradition. Later species build meaning upon those foundations. Homo naledi, therefore, represents an early stage in a continuum rather than an isolated anomaly. The difference between instinct and culture may not be a sharp boundary, but a gradual accumulation of shared behaviors. The species lived within that transition zone. Its extinction also illustrates a common pattern in evolution. Survival depends on matching present conditions. When environments change, previously successful strategies may no longer work. More flexible populations expand, while stable ones decline. The disappearance of Homo naledi reflects shifting balance rather than failure. Modern humans inherited a world once occupied by many relatives. The absence of those relatives today creates an illusion of uniqueness. Discoveries like this restore context, showing that humanity was once plural. Our species is the remaining branch, not the only one that ever existed. The chamber holds no art, no tools, no direct message, yet its silence conveys something significant. It shows that beings with familiar bodies and social bonds lived parallel lives beside our ancestors, following traditions that mattered to them even if we cannot fully interpret why. Future discoveries may clarify details. Additional sites could reveal daily living spaces, tool use, or clearer evidence of interaction. Or they may reinforce the mystery by adding more variation. Either outcome deepens understanding because it broadens the range of possibilities. In the end, Homo naledi does not provide a final answer about human origins. Instead, it alters the question itself. Rather than asking how humans became unique, science now asks how many ways being human can exist. The species stands as a reminder that evolution produces diversity before it produces dominance. Our history is not the story of a single line improving over time, but of many related forms sharing the same world, each adapted to its own circumstances. Some left tools, some left art, and some left only the careful placement of their dead in a dark chamber beneath the earth. All were part of the broader experiment of humanity, and understanding that complexity may be the most important discovery the fossils offer.